What is up, fellow learners? Ready to learn about Chapter 5 of Against the Grain by James C. Scott? Because I know I am. The main idea behind this section is that a fertile alluvium without workers to work the land is useless, and thus, people, such as slaves, were more valuable than the land or territory itself. An early state can be classified as a population machine, according to Scott, because it was very focused on the productivity and population of its domesticated subjects, yet it also broke down often, much like a machine. Much of this early statecraft was collecting people, settling them close to the core of the state, and having them produce an excess of crops, which was for the non-working elite class. And this process was often recreated by the Spanish conquistadors in America, who domesticated the indigenous people of America. One important point to be made about the state system is that a surplus is not naturally produced, because there's no incentive for making more than you need. One question that might be asked is, who the hell would want to join the state if you had to farm extra food and give it to non-working elites? And the truth is, I'm sure not very many people chose to do this voluntarily. Instead, slaves and prisoners of war were often used for such purposes. Since for early states people and slaves were more valuable than the territory itself, wars were often for capturing prisoners instead of capturing land. Some evidence of this is that the losers' lives in these wars were often spared. Because of this, most wars in this time period, which is 3500 to 3100 BCE, were not wars between large states, but excursions from each of those states to raid and conquer small communities in the hinterlands, vocab word, of the states. And this leads us to the next section, slavery and bondage in Mesopotamia. The world of Sumerians, Babylonians, Egyptians, and Assyrians were describable as a world without free men in this time, and for the most part it was true. In the broadest sense, the main question about slavery in this time period is not of its existence, but of its overall extent and importance to the economy of the early state, and the general consensus is that it was a relatively minor part of the economy. Slaves were needed for textile work as well as onerous canal digging and wall building. Uruk, which used slaves for this purpose, had a demographic of about 20% of their total population being enslaved. Slaves were treated very badly, often beaten with clubs, as well as constantly wearing shackles and fetters, and a substantial number of slaves died or were killed, likely because it was easy to acquire new slaves. Next section, Egypt and China. Although it is disputed whether or not there was slavery in the Old Kingdom of ancient Egypt, it is clear that the workload of normal subjects was quite arduous, and because of this, many people aspired to be scribes to save them from the hard work. In the Middle Kingdom period of ancient Egypt, something very close to chattel slavery existed, as laborers were gathered on a large scale to be bought, sold, and inherited by elites and merchants. And during the brief Qin dynasty of China, slavery was very important to the overall statecraft, and large-scale markets for buying and selling slaves were implemented. Next section, slavery as a human resources strategy. States that conquered small communities took captives of working age so that they could reap the benefits of the slaves who were raised at the expense of another society. Such slaves were not only used for menial field work, but also as specialty roles like boat builders, weavers, metalworkers, armorers, gold and silversmiths, artists, dancers, and musicians. Whether or not these slaves were assimilated into society easily depended largely on whether or not the captives were perceived as alien to the captors. Because of this, Greco-Roman slaves who were taken from across the Mediterranean were much less likely to be assimilated than Mesopotamian slaves who were more often taken close to home. And now, booty capitalism. Booty capitalism simply means, in the context of war, wars fought with the purpose of profit. Most of the wars in this time were fought when the grain was ripe so that war parties could maximize their loot. Early states rarely boasted of territory and instead boasted of bounty and prisoners because of this. And on to the next part, particularity of Mesopotamian slavery and bondage. One quote that sums up this section nicely is that the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. Besides sounding cool, this applies well to the early state slavery in Mesopotamia, Greek, and Rome, in that most slave labor was behind the scenes. Roughly half of the Greco-Roman slave population worked in quarries and mines away from the state and thus were largely invisible to the general public. And yeah, that's Against the Grain Chapter 5 by James C. Scott. Hope you enjoyed. Now I gotta edit. Awesome.